So I had this realization the other day regarding journalism, particularly journalism about climate change, because that's something I'm interested in. And it's pretty funny, and it's right there in plain sight. And I like it because it's one of those things, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it's going to change how you look at all the news articles you read forever. So to put this in context, let me tell you a little about myself. I have a degree in psychology with an emphasis in research design and statistical analysis. This was a curriculum that required a full year of 3 different statistics courses. And I also went above and beyond and took up to university level calculus because I wanted to get more exposure and take advantage of the opportunity. Now, to round it all out, I also got a minor in English. So why do I tell you this? Well, think about it. I started my day off and I would be working on research proposal, data gathering, experimental design. Then I'd go and crunch numbers, look for statistical significances, and then try to draw conclusions from that and then complete write-ups the way you would in a published scientific article. And then I would take a break from churning all these numbers and I'd walk across campus and I'd go to an upper division English level course. And I would go into a room full of people who were writers and English majors. I was about the only guy in there that was just getting a minor. And so these were people that had been writing for 4 years straight. And it was a very humbling experience because we would have to write essays and then read our best ones in front of the class. And I remember every week I'd have to get up in front of this room full of writers and read what was my best writing of that week. And it was tough because if you use like a music analogy, these people were playing music on their instruments and it was quite beautiful. I mean, they had emotional words and stories that would kind of pull you in, and it was dramatic and they were good. It was impressive. And then I would kind of stand up there and do the equivalent of playing Mary Had a Little Lamb, squeaking out my notes and awkwardly piecing together my phrases, and it was tough. It was tough for me to do, and I'm glad I did it. But then I would go back across the street and I would go back to working on my numbers and running data. But I was thinking about this, as good as these people were at writing, it's the only thing that they were doing. It's like you could spend 4 years at college and study the clarinet, and you'd be great at the clarinet, but you wouldn't be good at anything else. And I was thinking about it, and most people in an English curriculum, whether it's English major or journalism or they're going into teaching, there's very little to, depending on the university, maybe no math requirement at all. And then I was thinking back and I thought, even in high school, I took math all the way through, but you could stop taking math. It was up to 9th grade math, and then that was the only math you needed for your high school diploma. And I forget what it was, trigonometry or maybe even just geometry. And there was a lot of people that really struggled with that. And I started thinking about it and I was like, the people that were so good at writing in that class, they may have taken almost no math in college. They might have struggled their way through high school math. And perhaps the last time they had any competency in math was at the 8th grade or the 7th grade level. And so when you're reading the work of a journalist, you're dealing with someone who quite possibly might have a child's level of understanding of mathematics. They may be only able to do math at the 7th grade level or maybe lower. And so as developed as they are in one skill set, they're laughably poor in another. And I realize this causes a lot of confusion when they now try to write these ideologically driven science, quote, science articles about climate change. And it's the people writing about it are the last people you want trying to explain it because they have no inherent mathematical understanding at all. Behind every journalist is just a scared kid that didn't want to get called on in math class and spent their whole school career hiding from math. So let me show you how this manifests. So here's an article that emphasizes their ability to write chilling headlines. Climate models are running red hot, and scientists don't know why. The simulators used to forecast warming have suddenly started giving us less time. Very frightening, right? Well, don't just read the headlines. You've got to dig in and do some analysis here. Because you have the English major writing the emotional hook, but you can see there's a lot of data here and it doesn't support what he says. Eric Roston here writes, there are dozens of climate models, and for decades they've agreed on what it would take to heat up the planet by about 3 degrees Celsius. And it's an outcome that would be disastrous. Flooded cities, agricultural failures, deadly heat. But there's been a grim steadiness in the consensus among these complicated climate simulations. Then, last year, unnoticed in plain view, some of the models started running very hot. The scientists who hone these systems, they hone them. These systems use the same assumptions about greenhouse gas emissions as before and came back with far worse outcomes. Some produce projections in excess of 5 degrees Celsius, a nightmare scenario. So absorb those words, and then we look at this picture they painted, and then this is an image that they present us with in the article. And I've done a video on this already where a bunch of climate journalists got together and said, we have to stop using the polar bear on melting ice because it's not relatable enough. They said, we need to show pictures of people suffering because that apparently is going to be a little scarier, and this article doesn't fail to deliver. So the first thing you need to do when presented with propaganda is start picking apart inconsistencies and things that interfere with the narrative. For example, this little girl's got a mask on, and so you would think, oh no, the air quality must be terrible that they have to wear a mask, and she's front and center in this image. Of course, you'll notice mom's not wearing her mask, her brother isn't even carrying a mask, and his dad just has one right here. Looks like he's ready to drop it. Nobody else is wearing a mask. Oh, here, he's got one. Maybe this is the son's mask. He's running away with it. Maybe he's not the favorite. And then other things to look at. Mom's got hiking boots. She's ready for a long, arduous trip. But dad here is wearing flip-flops. And you got to ask yourself, you can't be walking far if you're wearing flip-flops. I don't care if you run out of the house because the climate change is ending the world. You're going to put on better shoes if you're going on some sort of serious trek. Also, the military officer here has no mask. So a lot of this is edited just to be scary looking. I would guess this backdrop here has been tinted, or, it could very well be blue sky that they've just dimmed, or low. You can adjust temp or whatever in a picture. This has been tampered with to make a grim, dark picture. So always be aware of this, and be sure to look at these pictures closely. So there's not yet an agreement on how to interpret these hotter results. I thought the science was settled, but there's not an agreement. The reason for worry is that these same climate models have successfully projected global warming for half a century. That's a lie, flat out. We had global cooling in the 70s, and Al Gore has been talking about an ice-free Arctic. I think it was in 2012, and then 2014. Glacier National Park had the Gone in 2020 signs on their glacier. This is just flat out untrue. These models have not predicted it correctly. So be sure to spot this sort of things that are just blatant untruths. If the same amount of climate pollution will bring faster warming than previously thought, humanity would have less time to avoid the worst impacts. So we have less than 12 years? Or is this the assumption of 2100? So the writer continues here. For now, however, there are doubts and worries. Scary language. A higher warming estimate probably isn't the right answer. So they're saying right here in the article that the title, that the climate models are running hot, which is meant to scare you into action, to quit thinking about it logically and just begin to run with your emotions. The scientist in the article says the higher estimate is probably wrong. And it goes on, this uncertainty over how to read the models highlights one of the central challenges of climate change. I mean, if we're recommending public policies and they're admitting flat out they don't know how to read the models, I mean, how do you even know how wrong you are if you don't know how to read it? It's like I tried to do a math book in French, but I don't know how to read French. So, how wrong are my answers? I don't know. I don't know how to read it. So they go on here. There are more than 100 models. Okay, keep that in mind. Over 100 models used to forecast the relationship between carbon and warming, developed by about 24 independent research groups, which is interesting too, because that means these research groups, that's not that many. Only 24? And they have over 100 models, so you're looking at what? Each one has about 4 models on average. They say it takes climate modelers who run hugely complex calculations on supercomputers, more than a biblical, for some reason they use that descriptive word, more than a biblical 6 days to create their virtual worlds. See, this isn't science. This is creating a simulation. This is like SimCity, right? Just because you're a good mayor in SimCity 2000 doesn't mean you're ready to be a mayor in the real world. See, science uses the scientific method. It's about reproducible, observable results in a lab. These are virtual worlds. These are man-made creations. Much like the models for the stock market and the housing market and the credit default swaps in 2008 were projecting, money from here on to infinity right before the market crashed. They had virtual worlds people were living in. So they have these modules for air, land, and sea, all churn together and interact, and through early runs, the researchers will make adjustments for troubleshooting and debugging, so they're still trying to figure out how to run these virtual worlds. They're still trying to make this SimCity simulation match up to being a real mayor. That amount to rewiring the whole world. Now that's a lot of inputs, and that's why you need a supercomputer to do it, and you're never going to model all the inputs in the real world. The first step is to replicate the actual conditions of the 20th century. Okay, in 2018, Nature magazine published an article. They had the most sophisticated thermometer mankind has ever had. It was at multiple levels in the Atlantic Ocean, and the scientists admitted we're still not sure what the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean was in 2018. So I don't know how you replicate something where you don't even know how to measure it real time in the real world with the most sophisticated instruments. This is all guesswork, guys. Then you can trust the software to forecast the future. No, you can't. That's not true either. Just because you can model the past doesn't mean you suddenly have a crystal ball into the future. Now, to get a little more into the weeds, scientists went on to try 300 configurations of rain, pollution, heat flows, something they can do as gods of their own digital earth. So they're playing civilization now, apparently, before matching the model to history. But by solving that puzzle, this guy's team sent future projections upward at an unheard of rate. NCAR found that CO2 doubling would lead to 5.3 C worldwide, I guess, a 33% jump from the model's past reading on global warming. And so the Earth could warm 3 degrees if CO2 doubles. You see, Russia has a model that says you'd raise 1.8 degrees. China has one that says 2.2. Norway has 2.5. A 27 model average says 3.8. And then here's the outliers. UK, and Canada. Now, maybe no political bias there, but really, come on. So in all, as many as a fifth of the new results have come in high. However, there are still dozens left to report. There are dozens of models. Contrast that with the fearmongery title of this article. And their results will determine whether these grim forecasts are outliers or significant findings. Well, I don't know how you can tell if they're significant findings because it's a computer program. If there does turn out to be a consensus around these new higher estimates that could have real impact on how governments and business respond to climate risk. First of all, consensus is not truth. For all we know, the Russian model is perfect, and it predicts the future, or the Chinese model, or the Norwegian model, or one of these 27 models, or one of the dozens of models left to report, or the 100 or so models in total. Why doesn't a consensus? Nothing says you take an average here or see where most of them land and that's truth. Consensus is not truth. Consensus is never truth. Just look at the heliocentric universe. Most people at one time believed the Earth was the center of the universe. That was the consensus. Consensus has no relationship with truth whatsoever. And that's why we have to question everything. So, 2 researchers recently suggested the world is on a pathway to warm 3 degrees by 2100, but that estimate could be as low as 1.9 or as high as 4.4, which is pretty significant. And notice why. Depending on how sensitive the real world climate turns out to actually be. So these models, they still have no idea within this massive range, and it could be lower or higher, I suppose, but they have no idea how it's going to line up. But I thought if they matched up to the past 100 years, you could then use that model to predict the future. Of course, here they admit you can't. That question hinges on if hot-running models are a match for reality or missing something, so now we have to wait and see. Climate models have been doing a fine job predicting warming for a long time. A recent study compared models as old as 1970 with the observations made in decades since. That's flat out untrue. I'll show you why, but that's untrue. And then they have this quote, particularly impressive were models from the 1970s because there wasn't much observable evidence for warming at that time. Back then, the paper noted the world was thought to have been cooling for the past few decades. So they thought the world was cooling, but their models said it was warming? Like, what's going on here? Were they reading their graphs upside down? I mean, this statement is a contradiction within itself. It's so incoherent, and yet to an English major that puts the science on a pedestal because he never took enough math or ran his own studies to understand the minutiae, this is like the new priest from on high came down and delivered truth. And they're just wangling it all and trying to form a coherent worldview, I guess. So, and this is an interesting thing to add. To a degree, every scientist suspects their model is wrong. There's even an aphorism about this. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So out of those 100 with all of their range of predictions, even scientists admit they're all wrong. because models aren't science. A digital model of the Earth is not the Earth. Now, maybe some are useful, but man, how do you know which ones? Especially with the wide range of discoveries that they lead to. So, those now attempting to figure out the mystery of the hot climate models think one factor might have caused the recent unusual result: clouds. It turns out simulated clouds often cause headaches for climate modelers. And I did a video on this. There was a Finnish research group that found out once you add clouds into climate models, all of the evidence for man-made global warming goes away. And these results were duplicated by researchers in Japan. When you factor in the effect of cloud cover, all evidence for global warming by man goes away. So they finish with, this is all going to be taken and amalgamated by the United Nations. The author of the main UN climate science reports will follow along and try to stitch together a big picture for release in 2021. Well, as they're doing their stitching and they're coming up with their new "we gotta save the world" narrative, just think about this from a practical perspective. You know, I think if you're a blue-collar guy, that you work with your hands, a construction worker, you might also see this real clearly, like it's real obvious. But you suddenly have a measuring tool that's massively uncalibrated. Like maybe you're a parent, and say you have one of these digital thermometers, and your kid says, you know, "Mom or Dad, I don't feel good." And you say, "Okay, well, come here," and you take their temperature, and, you know, maybe their forehead felt a little warm, and you pull the thermometer out, and it says 200 degrees. You go, "Oh my God, call 911. The thermometer says the child is 200 degrees. That they must be incredibly sick. You know, 100 is running a fever." And you talk to the nurse or whoever on the phone, and they'd laugh. Go, "Do you have another thermometer in the house? Because this one that's predicting catastrophe, that means your model's broke." When your instrument is broken, it'll give you all sorts of reasons, but it doesn't mean you've discovered some terrifying trend. It means you have a broken instrument, and that's all climate models are, is an instrument, a man-made instrument. And so lastly, let's close with looking what scientists were actually saying, say in 1978, about the future of Earth's climate.
Dr. Gifford Miller is a glaciologist from the University of Colorado. He's been studying the climate and glaciers of Baffin Island for the past 6 years.
For the last 3,000 years, the summer temperatures have been getting colder, and the amount of precipitation, rainfall and snowfall has decreased, so that the conditions have been drier and colder. And at the same time, the glaciers have expanded. In the most recent expansion, which occurred between 300 years ago and the turn of the present century, the glaciers attained their most extensive positions that they had during the last 8,000 years. The summer of 1972 was one of the most severe summers on record, and the ice never melted that summer. And when I returned to Broughton Island, one of the local settlements here, talking to the Inuit people, and they could only tell me that their fathers had told them of a time when the ice hadn't gone out.
This once-in-a-lifetime summer ice has surprised old-time Arctic residents. Ernie Sieber is superintendent of Baffin Island National Park and has lived in the Arctic for over 20 years.
We had, in 1973, we had ice all over at the East Coast. The fjords, some of the ice in the fjords didn't even leave. And almost every year since, we had ice moving in and out of the fjords. So it looks like the climate has changed. It looks like it turned colder.